Conference Board webcast series hosted in collaboration with the law firm of Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen & Hamilton. I'm Paul Washington, Executive Director of the ESG Center here at the Conference Board. The Conference Board is the world's leading independent nonprofit think tank devoted to serving business and society for over 100 years. The ESG Center focuses on issues of corporate governance, sustainability, citizenship, and philanthropy. The Conference Board is marshaling its resources on a global basis to help our members and the public navigate the COVID-19 pandemic with real-time information and insights, and I would encourage everyone to visit the content hub of our website, which you can find at www.conference-board.org. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, boards and managements of companies around the world were facing rising expectations and scrutiny from investors, customers, employees, regulators, and others as to how they conducted their business in the public interest. The pandemic has only raised the bar. Today, we're going to focus on governance and legal issues facing companies as they grapple with this unprecedented health and economic crisis. And to deal with these issues, I'm delighted to be joined by a number of world-class experts. We have Sarah Bosco, who's Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Secretary of Emerson Electric. Welcome, Sarah. We've got Rich Daly, the former CEO and now Executive Chairman of the Board of Directors at Broadridge. Welcome, Rich. And we've got David Lopez and Lisa Schweitzer, who are partners at the law firm of Cleary Gottlieb and are members of Cleary's COVID-19 Client Task Force. Welcome to you as well. Before we begin, I've got a few housekeeping matters to attend to. First, we are offering New York State CLE credit for participating in today's live program. For credit, you need to download the CLE verification and CLE evaluation forms posted in the download section at the bottom of your screen, complete the forms, and mail them to our friends at Cleary Gottlieb at the email address provided on the form. For attorneys seeking credit from outside New York, please list your relevant bar information on the verification form, and we'll work to see if we can get you credit as well. I will provide a verification code later in the webcast, which you'll need to write on the verification form to earn credit. For those who want CPE credit, you need to enter your full name, email address, and specify CPE in the request CPE credit space at the bottom of your screen. Please note that 3 pop-up messages will occur during the program to confirm your participation, and please click OK each time you see one of those. Second, I want to underscore that we really welcome audience participation today. You can ask questions at any time by entering them in the chat box at the left of your screen. We'll try to work them into the conversation as best we can. Finally, just a few other housekeeping notes. You can download the background materials and slide deck presentation in the Downloads section at the bottom of your screen. Next, please complete the evaluation form. This is separate from the CLE evaluation verification form at the end of today's session. That evaluation form will help us incorporate your feedback and improve future webcasts. Finally, if you want to see us even bigger than you can now, you can enlarge the video screen to a full screen view by clicking on the 4 arrows in the upper right hand of a corner of your screen. And now with those matters out of the way, let's turn to the business in front of us and talk about some of the key legal and governance issues that companies are grappling with. First, a threshold question to you, Sarah. You know, one of the big challenges, it seems, is just simply staying on top of these fast-moving and latest directives from the federal government, from state governments, from local governments, from international authorities. I mean, that's awfully important, not only to help the company and your board do what they need to do now, but frankly, you know, looking ahead, unfortunately, thinking about litigation. You know, obeying government orders is absolutely critical. But there's so many just pouring out these days. How is Emerson staying on top of it?
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Paul, for giving me the opportunity. I would say it's a gorgeous day in St. Louis, but we're all working from home, so we can gaze at it from afar. But we were very lucky, quote unquote, because this really started for us in China. We have 15 plants in China, and as they started to close down, we were already starting to deal with. And what we did in Asia, which really became the model for us in the rest of the world, unbeknownst to us at the time, was setting up the appropriate crisis management team, which was made up of HR, government relations, legal, of course the business management side as well, and really took a sort of divide and conquer approach, if you will. China was easy because they are very centralized, and so the directives that came down applied everywhere. There were local requirements. That was easier to handle because actually China was already shut down for Chinese New Year. But when things started moving across the globe and we started to see, first of all, Europe, we have large manufacturing base in the Lombardy area, so started and immediately created the crisis management team, I would say at the at one level below the C-suite, and that group was the group that handled all of the immediate things. So HR dealt with all the worker safety issues, whether we had proper PPE supplies, workforce matters. The immediate thing was to make sure that we could get the safety of the workers, and one of our labor lawyers was part of all of that team in Europe. We had government relations handling all the liaison between the regions, the national governments. That certainly was a good model for us here in the U.S. because it became very decentralized here in the U.S. And so they really worked with, we work a lot with NAM, the National Association for Manufacturing, as well as the U.S. Chamber to try to bridge what they were doing with the state governments and trying to get alignment on that. Then you had just what was going on the ground. I really call it guerrilla warfare because the legal teams, and we have lawyers based throughout our businesses in the U.S. as well as internationally, primarily supporting sites. And so as one state directive or county or city directive came up, it was really the law team or the legal team that had to get their hands on the directive, understand what it said, how it applied to us. One of the things that we took a very, very broad view of what essential services were and really started from that perspective. So we looked at the definitions under the CISA guidelines, and even though a state might be a little bit more narrow, we really tried to take a very broad view and then would only work down from there if there was specific requirement or directive from a local government. And that, for the most part, worked well. The initial states that came out were very far from the CISA guidelines. We actually had a foundry that got shut down because foundries were specific on the list of the location, but was not in the CISA guidelines. And so we had to, of course, deal with the local government in order to get that reopened, which we eventually did. And so it's over time, over the last 3 weeks, it's actually gotten easier as the later states have actually been a lot more aligned with what's going on at the federal level. But what that allowed us to do then was, as a legal team, to create a whole set of templates that we could use as states and other directives came out. Since we were essential services, what did employees need to get back and forth to the plant? What did the plant need on site in the event we got visited? What documents did we need to arm our teams with in order to be able to address any concerns that might be raised by employees, first of all, because employees are reluctant to come in, to raise with the government, should they come and pay us a visit or give us a call, and then other external stakeholders. The other thing that we did that I think has been really effective is we set up a team site fairly early on in the process, trying to create, I kind of call it a single source of truth. And in a situation like this, it's very difficult. There is just information flying everywhere, contradictory information. You don't know what's the source. You don't know where it's coming from. But we try to create a place where supply chain could go, HR, legal, GR, government relations, as a place where we were posting and putting together kind of a database of all the things that we were finding and making sure that everybody had the same information, or at least starting from the same information. So our crisis management team, sort of that level below the C-suite, meets every morning, and then the C-suite meets every afternoon at 2 o'clock to get an update from that crisis management team, as well as looking at how the business, the higher level issues on impact to business and communications. From a communications perspective, we've also I call it kind of a divide and conquer. So our CEO has been out in videos to all employees, also given several interviews both in our local press and national press about what we're doing as a company to support our communities. We have platform leadership. They're out there talking and sending out communications and trying again to address concerns that our employees will have, but as well as our supply chain, our customers, the government, and all kind of trying to speak from the same perspective and being aligned on communication. So that's how we kind of came to that working protocol.
Great, thanks. It's really helpful. I think there are a number of great insights as to how companies can tackle this. The lawyers being on the front line, undoubtedly working around the clock sometimes, getting the information, having a cross-functional sort of level, the team below the C-suite, staying on top of things, which is separate from your C-suite level, which is also meeting every day, and then sharing that information. I think that notion of the single source of truth, so everyone, your business people, your HR people, all the folks can work off the same information is really great advice for companies right now. So thanks for sharing that. Let me turn to the role, if I could, of the board of directors. So, you know, Rich, you've been on both sides of the equation here as the CEO, and now I know you're executive chairman, but as chairman of the board. How do you make sure that the board is appropriately fulfilling its role here, doing everything it should, but not overstepping and even interfering in the process? So what advice do you have for boards? Yep.
Sure. Paul, nod if you can hear me.
Loud and clear.
Good. Thank you. So, perfect. Let me start by saying that you know, I've been through from the '87 crisis to the current crisis, but the major difference with this crisis is we're talking about the very real threat of loss of life versus the loss of shareholder value. So this is unprecedented in terms of the just brutal nature of what we're dealing with. I think the financial crisis gives me the best ability to relate to this group. I was a new CEO, spun out 100% out of ADP. We spun out in April of '07. In September of '07, it started with Bear Stearns going into SIPC. And then, of course, when Lehman went, that was the beginning of the full-blown global financial crisis. Both Bear and Lehman were customers, and even though I'd been running the brokerage group within ADP for a long period of time, I had a relatively short period with a new board. The majority of directors I had not met until a dinner the week before we spun out in April of '07. So in our case, it was really important that we got trust advanced far beyond the number of years or the year that we had actually been working together at that point. And because it was clear that when you have a management team working 24/7, it's imperative that that management team believes they're fully empowered to make decisions, that the board has trust in that management team. And the best way we did that was through, I'll call it, not lots of meetings, not lots of decisions, but extreme transparency to what was going on. So in my case, I was giving the board back then, because I was new to them, literally daily, everyday updates. Keeping them informed was critical, because there would be things that we would be deciding as it related to certain capital issues, as it related to certain economic decisions that needed the criteria per our bylaws and agreement that I would need to get approval from. In the case of Broadridge today, we're far more fortunate. I stepped down as CEO, became executive chair in January of 19. I recruited Tim Goki, our CEO, 10 years or 9 years before I stepped down. I did it to broaden our business model, but I also, the board and I were very clear, we were hiring someone to do that who we believed might be able to be a successor 9 years before we were thinking I would be stepping down. So the board has had great knowledge of Tim, transparency to Tim, and trust in Tim before we got to this place. So we're really operating from an advantage. The priorities that we're looking at and that Tim is keeping us updated on is first and foremost our associate safety. For those of you who only think about Broadridge as the annual meeting or communications business, you know, there are about 200 offerings, the most noteworthy of which is we generally do about 6 trillion a day in settlements. Now, those volumes, we know the volumes are up 150% going back over the last couple of weeks. I don't know if that means 15 trillion, 12 trillion, 10 trillion, but, you know, a trillion here, a trillion there, we're talking about real money. And so the Treasury is very, very involved with us. The regulators are very, very involved with us. We have been keeping the SEC updated, for example, on annual meeting status and the delivery of those materials. And, you know, keeping customers updated. There are literally, you know, that 6 trillion normally involves everybody, 80 plus clients from JP Morgan to E-Trade and everybody in between. They're all running on our platform. So there's customer updates every morning at 6 a.m. The Treasury participates in that. There's liquidity updates internally. There's financial updates that the board is getting. We're not talking about going forward, but we will do a meeting in between our May scheduled meeting, early May, where we'll cover all of these items. There's investor updates, and then there's what we're doing in our communities to support those communities during this terrible time. Now, from a board point of view, everything I just described, our CEO is sending out a weekly memo, okay? And we deemed as a board that weekly was adequate because there is such a high level of confidence in Tim, and he's so well known to all of the directors at this point in time. If it was the case where we had just gone through a succession with an outsider, we would probably be doing, or I would be suggesting as executive chair, what I did in the financial crisis, where I wasn't that well known to our board, and where I was providing them literally every day email, 7 days a week, as to where we were, the status of getting Lehman customers out of Lehman into a new broker dealer, the status of where we were with the Fed and the Treasury, in setting up new broker dealers for customers we could get out of Lehman. So it was a very different time, but I hope that's helpful giving you the perspective. You know, in our prep call, I said, you know, I really feel badly for any company where the board and the CEO don't have a strong basis of trust. Because without that trust right now, when empowerment is so important for management, it's going to make a very, very difficult scenario.
Right.
Paul, anything else?
I think that's really helpful. It's the combination of trust, transparency, and frequency of communications that sort of all are in a dynamic relationship with each other. So let's.
And for every company, because it will be a little different, to identify the key issues that you want to keep your board up to.
So that's exactly what I'd like David to address. So, you know, we recently did a survey of about 20 to 30 companies who are members of the conference board, and found that during this phase of the crisis, boards are largely filling an oversight role, not so much decision making. We'll get to that in a bit, but an oversight role. So what are the main areas that a board should be focusing on, should be asking questions about right now?
Paul, I think there are going to be a lot of answers to that question depending on the individual industry and circumstances of the company. And the overall advice, obviously, is for any board to exercise both common sense and a sense of situational awareness. But at a general level, I'll tell you some of the issues that are coming up that I think are most important for boards to stay on top of. The first issue relates to survivability. There are quite a number of clients that we have whose liquidity position as of 4 or 5 months ago was really impeccable, who now are in a very different environment. And for those companies, focusing on liquidity and getting real stress tests from management are important. And any stress test that you receive today should not look like the stress test from 6 months ago. It's really got to be based on a whole different set of assumptions and potential disaster scenarios. Not that all of those scenarios are going to come to fruition, but you really got to be thinking about what the worst case looks like. And that's obviously difficult to judge because the duration and intensity of this crisis is still a subject of debate. That's the kind of information I think management needs in order to assess liquidity, and then it needs to be thinking about what its alternatives are to generate more liquidity. The other thing I would mention, second thing I would mention, is a focus on strategy in light of the business model. It's important, obviously, to focus on how the business model is functioning today in the midst of the crisis, but I think it's also important for boards to encourage management to be thinking about what things are going to look like 6 months or a year from now after we're through, hopefully through the worst of the virus, because the business model you have today may not be viable in its current form over the medium to long term. There are some industries that I think, and sectors of the economy, that will just be different after this crisis is over and be different in a fundamental way going forward. I would also highlight counterparty risk. Business does not stand as an island. It has customers, it has suppliers, and those, on both ends, there is a level of distress out there in the market. And I would be asking management to monitor the early warning signs of that kind of distress, and then coming up with plans for ameliorating the distress. There may be situations in which a cooperative arrangement with your customers or your suppliers is appropriate. There may be situations in which you need a plan B in the event that there are defaults. And then finally, I would just mention the health and safety has been mentioned a moment ago, but I'd also mention the point about morale in the workforce, because a lot of hard decisions are being made. Employees are being laid off, furloughed, hours are being reduced, etc. It's a whole panoply of actions that are being taken, which I'm sure boards are thinking about carefully. But I would also focus on morale, because at some point we're going to come out of this crisis and the workforce is going to have to come back, and the way they were treated, the level of respect, the level of communication, I think will be important to how those employees feel once they're back in their seats. Those are the things I would think boards and management ought to be thinking about.
That's great, and actually that's consistent with recent survey and work we've done at the conference board. The number one issue that boards are addressing right now, we've heard in their oversight role, is workforce, and then right after that comes immediate financial condition and so forth. So Sarah, sitting either as a GC or put on a board of directors member hat, what are the kinds of questions boards should be asking about the workforce right now?
Well, I think that we actually have a board meeting coming up, and so we're getting ready for that. I think certainly as not only as a GC or a director, but also as an employee, I'd want to know first and foremost what are the safety measures you put in place in your facilities. That is the #1 priority, and to ensure that, and then get an update on, how's it worked. Are you seeing, have you benchmarked other companies? What do we think is working in terms of employee morale? I think the David's point is a very good one. So those are the kind of questions I think that I expect them to ask, and certainly we're prepared to answer, because these are questions that we need to know, and we want to be able to communicate that not only to the employees themselves, but also to the board.
Great. And
give them a sense of kind of what we've been dealing with on the worker safety. So I think it's worker safety. Obviously, if you have someone who comes down with the virus, those sorts of issues, I'm sure we will get into, and the board will have questions around those sort of. You might think they're very detailed, but I think in this pandemic, they're asking it of their families, their other boards, other companies. They're getting asked. I'm sure they'll ask us the same questions.
Right, and that gives the board a sense of the degree of responsiveness and preparedness that the company has.
Absolutely.
And the knowledge that your CEO and others at the top actually have of what's going on. So it's a way of testing, are they really on top of this? Are they really engaged? So the other, thanks. And so the other area, Lisa, was key focus is liquidity, financial condition, capital markets, the financial survivability. What are the sort of main topics or main questions that boards should be asking in those areas to get meaningful answers?
Sure. I think that what makes this current situation more difficult than other major events is that if you look at a hurricane or a flood or a product recall or a litigation, it's a one-time event. It's something you can put your hands around. You might not know the total economic impact, but you can start modeling around it. Here, we don't know the full scope, extent, or duration of what we're experiencing. And so I think the things that you've heard so far in terms of just thinking through different scenarios and thinking through what worst-case scenarios could look like or longer-term issues could be is really important, and as David said, to keep refreshing on those issues. And so when you think of your capital markets and your financial condition, it's all about liquidity now. Whether you're a distressed company or not a distressed company, your #1 issue is going to be, how do I maintain adequate liquidity and how do I manage my costs? And so on the liquidity side, even healthy companies are looking of what their available lines are, whether they can draw, whether they should draw, to look at these questions on an immediate basis, on a 3-month, 6-month, and a longer basis, because things that might not be an issue today might be an issue later. So you have to think about what your decision points are now in terms of borrowing money, writing checks, for what you're able to do today and what you're able to do if this is a prolonged situation for your business. I think that on the cost-cutting side, obviously everyone's going to individually scrutinize where their costs are and what's not necessary, but also how to manage the expenses that may be out there. Certainly anything like stock dividends or stock buybacks and things like that. People are looking at executive compensation programs. Those are sort of your obvious checklist. But to go beyond that and to think about on a commercial level, whether you have counterparties to manage or you have internal costs to manage, of what you can do to stagger those, to account for them, and to plan for them, because you know some of them are going to be coming and you're going to have to deal with them. So make sure people are asking these questions early and thinking about cash and liquidity on a longer-term view as things can go to a prolonged state. I think the other thing that's been interesting is obviously the headlines are always about the person who refuses to pay rent, the person who is furloughing employees. But it's a good question for boards and companies also to ask of how you can make the best of a situation or capitalize particularly on a spin around an issue. So some people are offering free access for customers for short periods of time, which it seems like how could you do that on a liquidity basis, but it might be a way of not losing a customer or about bringing in a new customer in a time that you otherwise would be narrowing your customer base. Also, people are offering rebates, and the insurance companies, some of them just announced rebates for drivers who aren't driving as much. I don't have any personal information on it, but something like that could be motivated by the fact that someone otherwise canceling their auto policy because now their car is in the garage and they're not driving. And so I just offer those as isolated examples of thinking about where your potential weaknesses can be and how to manage through them, not just by playing defense, but by being creative and thinking about ways to get in front of issues and to be able to think how your strategies today are going to develop your long-term strategy for staying in the market and maintaining your business.
Right. So I think that's really important. So even if you're thinking about near-term survivability, you need to be thinking about the implications for the somewhat longer term, and also important, obviously, to avoid optimism bias in all of this scenario planning, right? So Sarah, we talked about some areas for board oversight of the workforce and of liquidity and so forth. In terms of board decision making, where you're actually taking board votes on things, what are you saying you're doing? What are other companies that you're aware of doing in places where you're actually asking, okay, I need a board vote on this, and could one of those board votes be, we're officially delegating more authority to management right now in these following areas. Maybe companies aren't doing that yet. So what are areas for board decision making?
Yeah, Paul, before I answer that question, I just wanted to add one more note about a question that the board may ask on workforce, and that's something that we addressed, and that is leadership coverage. So if someone were to get sick, what's our plan for making sure that we have the necessary leadership that can continue to make the management decisions that have to be made in this kind of a situation. To be honest, I don't know that we really we of course always think about CEO succession, that's a natural thing, but in a pandemic when things are changing so fast and we don't know where where you might be exposed, it really forced us, I think, to think, well, hold on a minute, the board's going to need to know who will they turn to if our CEO gets sick, for example.
And you also probably want to have some board succession planning or emergency planning in place too. So if you've got a lead independent director, who steps into that person's shoes? And how do you handle quorum and so forth if the worst happens? So So
I didn't want to lose the opportunity.
No, thank you.
That because I think it's important. But in terms of decision making, the big one, of course, is executive compensation.
Mm-hmm.
So depending on your charters and who has the authority to decide CEO compensation, executive management compensation, director compensation, those things are all up for grabs right now. And so we are, I think that is a key, whether it's the full board, it's your compensation committee decision, all those things are in play, and those are things that, we've dealt with. The interesting thing about a crisis like this in distressed assets is that there are distressed assets. And so that often gives us, companies who have grown, as we have through acquisition, a real opportunity to look at, are there assets out there that are now suddenly becoming, quite attractive from a valuation perspective, and how do you balance that with all the other things you're trying to get done? I think the long-term, to Lisa's point, the long-term view that you have the company balanced with the short-term real crises is something that I know our board is going to be asking, and because we are always in acquisition mode, we give an update on acquisition possibilities at every board meeting, and it's going to be no different as we try to reach that right balance between the very short term and then the long term. And the other area I would say is enterprise risk.
Mm-hmm.
How has that, because we give the board an update on an annual basis. We have a very rigorous enterprise risk identification process. I think this crisis, really tells us that there are things that we would never have thought about. And how do we communicate and how do we identify what those risks are, and then how do we communicate about mitigation and workarounds on those, and then we have to communicate that to the board. So I think the board is going to ask us a lot of questions: cybersecurity risk, supplier integrity, and survivability of suppliers. These are issues that we might not have thought of in quite the same way that we need to do now, in light of now we know what can happen.
Yeah, so it's going to be transformative in that way. And when it comes to executive compensation, boards are, I think, going to need to be pretty sensitive about not being seen to be giving windfall grants either to themselves as directors or to executives with share prices at a depressed level. So
that would be a non-starter. I think in this environment.
But it's we've seen some companies announce that they want greater flexibility so they can give away more, can grant more shares, and that's something I think for boards to be sensitive to, because companies
I agree with that.
By their employees as well as by their investors as how they dealt with executive compensation during this time. So additional challenges. So before we get into more specific legal issues, I want to just turn to the question of fiduciary duty. They're the same, loyalty and care. But David, are there steps, additional or specific steps that boards should be taking right now to make sure that they are fulfilling their fiduciary duties and, almost as importantly, creating the record that they're doing so during this crisis?
I think that I think there are a couple of things, but they're mostly things that Sarah has already mentioned. It's a question of the board being fully informed and asking pertinent questions along the way, and also I guess having a culture of holding management accountable for the full supply of information. I think boards are for any company that's in the crosshairs of the virus, boards are meeting more frequently, requesting more frequent updates, and trying to stay a little bit more apprised of day-to-day information. Not necessarily making day-to-day decisions, but being more apprised of day-to-day developments. Which is important in an environment where everything is shifting so quickly and so radically from day to day. I think that's the main thing that I would focus on, is the attentiveness.
Okay, and I think there's sometimes a tension here. If people look at things purely from a litigation standpoint, I've experienced this where the litigators say, well, don't make a record here, because whatever you tell the board, someone can challenge it. But on the other hand, if you don't have an adequate record or you don't have adequate materials, the board can't actually do its job, and frankly, it can backfire on you later on. So documenting all of this is, I think, generally going to be important. It's going to be hard to be criticized for giving your board too much, even if you didn't cover absolutely everything in that report. The fact that you covered the bulk of the issues is I think, going to be helpful, right?
Yes, if I could.
Yeah, that's right. And I think there's a difference. Sir, go ahead, please.
Oh, no, you can finish. Go ahead.
Yeah, David.
I was going to say that I think that the documentation question frequently comes down to, in some sense, a question of degree. There are steps, procedures, thought processes, and information gathering that needs to take place. What you probably will avoid is documenting the actual decision-making process, because that's probably the area where the documentation potentially could come back to bite you if you're second-guessed.
Got it.
I was just going to add on.
Sorry, Lisa, you were going to say
something? Yeah, I was
something?
just going to add on. I think I completely agree on just making sure you have a good record for the decisions you're making. But as we've all discussed, the financial information is constantly changing. The news is changing. There's a lot of instability in the world. So unless you're overly optimistic, as long as you're operating prudently, you probably have the systems in place to create a good record on that. And I wouldn't only think of it as a litigation issue. I would think of it as what's your reputational risk in this situation. And it's not just a matter of a lawsuit, but what are the things that are going to damage your brand, going to damage your reputation. And I think if you look at the headlines in the paper today, most of that is around employees, workplace safety, customer exposure, and the things that are very personal in nature. And so whether or not those are going to be the biggest lawsuit issues or dollar issues, I think that that's really worth thinking about as a fiduciary duty and just as a reputation and protection of the company itself, is to really focus on just being out in front and being very thoughtful on how your business is operating, the potential issues that are being raised about the way your business is operating, and particularly when people start returning to work and opening up the customer flow and dealing with less social distancing, how are you going to navigate those issues to be proactive, to be commercial, but also to strengthen and protect your reputation in that instance? And I think that the importance of that cannot be underestimated at this time.
Yeah, I think that's a critical point, that boards often in the past, in other crises, may have thought of, okay, what do we need to do to protect our, they're thinking about their investors and they're thinking about the plaintiff's bar, right? How do we protect against that? But during this, you know, the stakeholder model of awareness for boards was present before this, and I think it's only accentuated now. And, you know, this is a time where trust can really be lost or can be gained with your employees, your customers, regulators, the public at large. And so this is a time to really keep multiple stakeholders in mind, and I think that's likely to continue. So we'll get back to the sort of broader things later as well, but that's a great point, Lisa. So David, maybe we'll do a little bit of a rapid fire round of set of legal questions here. So a lot of companies are withdrawing their quarterly earnings guidance. They provide investors. What are you seeing, and what do you think boards should be considering when they're looking at whether to withdraw their guidance? David, you may be muted.
There. Is that better?
That's better.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
okay,
we can hear you now. Thanks.
So yes, many companies are pulling their guidance. That's very natural given the dislocations that we're seeing out in the marketplace. I think both CFOs and IR departments are getting pummeled with questions, and for FD purposes, you can't give one-off answers. But on the other hand, it seems a little incongruous to leave that guidance out there if it's obviously overly optimistic. What are the concerns? I think the one concern is that pulling the guidance is really the only first step in the road of communicating with your investors. Once you pull that guidance, what we've seen are companies where the analyst community and the investment community is left at sea. They don't really know how to value the stock anymore. And that's particularly true. It's true on the revenue side, but it's also particularly true on the cost side, because companies have taken different strategies to bringing their cost structures down in the light of declining revenue. And it turns out that for most businesses, taking cost out is not a flip the light switch kind of exercise. It takes time. You have to wind down certain activities. And by the same token, other companies are making different choices about whether to cut salaries, keep salaries in place, pay partial salaries. So I find that communication is really the thing that the board needs to focus on, what kind of communication to have with investors. And what we're seeing is a real desire, a real thirst for additional flexibility and frequency in communication with investors to try to close down the potential gap that may exist between the investment community and what management is seeing and the board is seeing in terms of real revenue numbers. So we're seeing companies that are, right now we're at April 9th, we're seeing companies that are preparing to pre-release some statistics on their earnings for Q1. We've seen a variety of companies write letters to their stakeholders, which are then published through an 8K or perhaps some other means, posting on the website. And these letters attempt to paint a picture as to what the impact of the virus has been on the business at an operational level, paint a picture of the company's response plan, try to show how they're dealing with their workforce, hopefully in a sensitive way, and this is a new method of communication. It's like a dear shareholder or dear stakeholder type of letter, which I think is very effective. It's a very flexible format for communicating. And then in a few select cases, I've actually seen companies, at the same time that they're abandoning their full year guidance, they are trying to give guidance for the current quarter. Very short term, but it's an attempt to help through a series of assumptions, usually stated in the guidance, to give the analysts some anchor, some reference points so that they can come back to alignment with the management team. I think those are the considerations as to which of those paths to go down and whether more flexible means of communication is a net benefit for the company.
Great. So key lesson there is fill the gap. Don't leave one if you're withdrawing guidance. And let me just take a moment here, sorry everyone,
Right.
but housekeeping. I'd like to give everyone the verification code again for CLE credit. This is one of the questions that's popping up from our viewers. It's 12028. Given the amount of time we've got left, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, and we may come back to some other questions as well. Let me do a question on contractual provisions. You know, force majeure is a phrase that sort of like flattening the curve that everyone's talking about today that they might not have just a few weeks ago, right? So a lot of contracts have these provisions that relieve a party of the obligations to fulfill it because it's beyond their control and it wasn't something that they could have anticipated and so forth. But it's a double-edged sword because companies are on both sides of this. They can seek relief because they're prevented from fulfilling their obligations, but they're also on the other side where people are supposed to be doing things for the company can say, well, we're not going to do them now. So double-edged sword, these provisions. So Lisa and maybe Sarah, what's your advice for companies in dealing with force majeure provisions and maybe other ones?
Sure.
So Lisa, maybe
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Sarah. You can go first.
Okay, I was just going to give you what we've done, not what, and I don't know if that's helpful at all. So the first thing, actually this started, you can tell me whether it's good or not. So the first thing we did, perfect answer. So the first thing we did, because this started in China, when China started to close down, we were concerned about projects starting to slow down and customers and pulling back projects and suppliers were shut down, et cetera. So at that time, we said, okay, as a legal team, and we're about 250 strong across the globe, we felt that we needed to be aligned. So don't try to deal with each contract piecemeal. Let's understand the whole picture. Get the contract, see what it says, et cetera. And so when it started moving across the globe, and we realized we were going to potentially have a lot more issues, we created a force majeure task force. And so that group meets every week. Obviously, that may not be as responsive as we might need to do on a contract-by-contract basis, but I would say for the most part, we haven't seen zero, but we haven't seen a flood of force majeure notifications, nor do we feel that we will need to give a lot of notifications. But they are starting to creep up, and so we thought that having this task force who would sort of be monitoring and bringing the different scenarios back to the group, we would have a much better ability to address different aspects of what was coming up. We've also have, as part of that Teams database that I talked about at the beginning, there is a force majeure, channel, where there's a lot of discussion and any documents that we might be using to notify, or what we've received in terms of notifications on there, so people have that information as well. So I just wanted to say that that's kind of how we are trying to address it, and we'll see, where it ends up. So far, the ones that we've gotten, we've managed to negotiate a commercial arrangement. We prefer not to go down, to get into any serious dispute resolution type discussions. So we've been able to keep it at a commercial level. And frankly, I think customers and suppliers are just trying to figure out a way to meet obligations and keep the business going. So.
Well, that sounded like an excellent answer to me. Lisa, any thoughts to add?
No, I agree. There are a lot of the best practices, and you stole some of the thunder. I was going to say, when I hear force majeure, I don't think of flattening the curve. I think more like the statute of frauds or rule against perpetuities, these things you learn in law school that every lawyer knows to grab for, but you're not quite sure of all the details about it. And so to just flag off some of them, I'm sure everyone knows them and could sing along together, but the force majeure is an inability to perform. It's not just harder or it costs more, governed by local law, governed by contractual provisions. And so Sarah is right that you need to look at your contracts. We have technology we've used with people to grab and review contracts on a large basis to help those types of reviews. But I agree with Sarah, made some excellent points in terms of knowing the law, knowing how it works, and centralizing communication, that it's, these will be claims, suggestions asserted on informal and formal basis at the relationship level with your suppliers and customers, but to have a central view, particularly for material contracts and relationships, of what you are and are not communicating about, whether not just force majeure, but frustration or complexity generally. What's your conversation with your counterparties and what messages are you sending out on these issues? I think this is also just like we were talking about financial forecasting. This is going to change. It changes every day. It's one thing to say it's hard for me to ship. It's another thing to say it's hard for me to ship because the government has now closed the port and closed my factory and won't let two people in a truck together, as a hypothetical, right? And so there is a point where certain doctrines, whether it's force majeure or something else, might come in legally that you might not be able to get to the commercial situation. So far, I think Sarah's spot on that people are trying to commercially navigate through these issues, but you do want to think about it because it can come up in all sorts of your commercial contracts, but also maybe something that's a lease or an employee issue or something that you don't necessarily see it coming now or that's going to be a big issue. So centralize, know your customers, and know your contracts, know your legal issues, take consistent positions, and generally try to deal with things on a commercial level, but be sure that you have a sort of, I like your single source of truth, but a single source of authority, a single source of decision-making for the things that might be coming down the road, and that can be forward-thinking in terms of how developments might affect your willingness or your need to invoke different legal defenses.
That's terrific. So we've got time for a couple more questions. I want to cover annual meetings. So, Rich, this is a big part of your company's business. What are you seeing right now? Are companies going ahead with in-person meetings? Are they doing virtual meetings? Are only meetings? Are they doing hybrid meetings? What are some of the practices that you're seeing out there, and how do companies get ready for that?
Okay, so let me give people, I think will be some good news here. Actually, we're in the week of the highest amount of distributions of sending out materials for annual meetings. Broadridge is agent for well over 1,000 bank and broker nominees. Of those distributions, 80% of it is without paper, and that 80% represents 95% of the outstanding shares. So for the vast majority of companies, the shares that Broadridge represents, which in virtually all cases is the majority of shares, those shares will be distributed electronically and we're not finding any issues with those votes coming back, all right? We are meeting the criteria on the 20% physical materials of the 5 days in the vast majority of cases. The SEC has issued some loose guidance from the staff level saying that for companies involved in printing and distribution, the safety of their employees is a precedent. All right, so but we just had our facilities certified by a pandemic expert, the same individual who approved Javits Center to be opened. This was done at 8:30 this morning, and we were told that the facility is as safe as it can be. What we have to start issuing is PPE for people when they commute and when they go home. Now, let's go to the numbers. Broadridge last year did about 350 virtual annual meetings. We're up over 1,500 at this point in time. If you've already distributed the materials, the SEC will allow you to put on your website that you're going to convert your meeting to a virtual meeting without redistributing those materials. Now we need to get involved with state law. Delaware and about 20 plus other states allow virtual meetings. So depending on when you're incorporated, you need to check into that. Major states like New York have issued a temporary allowing of virtual meetings during the pandemic. This is a really good idea to get those states to consider this going forward, because the companies are finding about 6 times the virtual participation that they normally get in a physical actual meeting. So knowing where you are with the state laws, only about 150 companies have delayed their meetings, and these are primarily REITs and MLPs, all right, when it wasn't clear if they would be able to get the quorum. So Broadridge is open. 10,000 of our associates are working from home. So your client service rep, if you would email them or send a note out to Broadridge, someone will get back to you. We can give you instant stats as to where you stand and to what your options are. I will tell you, because of the significant increase, all right, we are getting concerned about capacity issues in the number of meetings we can add to the virtual calendar at this point in time, right?
Right.
But we will do everything to accommodate everyone to have a successful quorum and a successful meeting and move on from there. Any questions, Paul?
No, that's great. And some of those virtual meetings will be audio only because of capacity issues, I assume. We are only adding audio only meetings at this point. Got it. Useful to know. And the conference.
The logistics of doing the video is going to require far more prep and far more capacity than virtually most companies could do at this point.
Okay.
If a company has its own studio and its own very strong capabilities, we can engage with them in a dialogue on that.
Got it. So we're going to run a touch over just, again, CLE credit, the verification code is 12028. And I want to end on a broader note, if I could, and we'll go around the table here. So what long-term impact do you think this crisis, looking ahead, we're all in about insights for the future, what broader impact do you think this crisis will have on the role of boards, of in-house legal counsel, on the overall governance and legal landscape as we emerge from this crisis? Sarah, would you kick us off?
Yeah, sure. I actually mentioned it earlier. I think enterprise risk is going to be a much bigger topic. We cover it already, but I think that the board's going to be a lot more probing about the measures that we're taking around how do we identify the risks, what are they, what's the impact to the business, there may, we do it, we rank tier them based on financial impact. Is the financial threshold going to change from a board perspective just because of, the situation? And so I'm going to expect, or I think we may even be proactive about trying to get that in front of the board probably a little bit more often and, devote perhaps more time than we had in the past. I think that cyber risk had already been near the top. I think given with people working remotely from home, there's a lot more issues that are going on. We have seen an increase in cash fraud, cash transfers, schemes, things like that, donations for pandemic response, PPE equipment that are fake, usage of our top executives' emails has become very sophisticated. So we've already, it's already been at top of mind for the audit committee, but I think we're going to see a lot more of that, and which will increase costs for the company if we need to take greater measures and be more transparent about what we're doing. And just on just a touch on legal, because I think most of the audience are coming from the legal side, I think that if anything, this pandemic has really shone a light on the ability for lawyers to really help the companies solve very immediate, very tight time frames because of the ability to, get their hands-on orders. I think there's been a level of collaboration across the legal community, not just within my own company, but just across other companies here in the St. Louis area, but I think more globally, about what are you seeing, what are you doing, has anybody seen this? I think that is, to me, has been a godsend in terms of trying to get your hands around it. But I think it's also enabled me and my team to be much more visible and timely to management. This is what we're seeing. They know we're out there talking to other companies. We are a channel to bring that information back to our own management teams to make good decisions. So I think, to me, that's really been, unfortunately, I don't like the circumstances, but I think it's kind of forced a light on the law department that we may not have had quite so immediately.
It's really interesting, and not just being issue spotters, but really problem solvers and partners that bring information from the outside world, and strengthening the bonds of trust between the law department and the rest of the organization. I think that's terrific. David, your thoughts on how this may affect the broader landscape? David, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. I agree with everything that Sarah said. I think she's really spot on. I think only maybe two things to add. One is that I think there's going to be more, there should be more focus on what I'll broadly call disaster recovery, because in a sense, if you think about the terrorism of 9/11, a lot of companies were in the New York area, I know, were forced to work remotely, and they geared up for that. This is a different kind of crisis, but it's forced more companies to be out of commission or out of their offices for a longer period of time, and it's put certain strains on technology. It's put an emphasis on having all aspects of the business be replicatable from a remote environment. There are some companies where perhaps the professionals were able to work remotely because they were used to traveling, but the finance function wasn't able to do that. And so I think you've seen that work itself out a little bit. But there are also strains on internal controls and controlling the flow of information. A lot of companies have found that their internal controls over information don't work in this environment very well because more people have access to information and different types of information that they normally would not have in a status quo environment. So thinking about how your disclosure controls and your controls over information and your disclosure committee, how they function in this environment, I think will have to be re-examined a bit. I think the only other thing I would mention is what I mentioned before, which is I think that the question as to how, what the long-term impact of this experience is on the way that we conduct business in this country, I think will have to be factored in by boards into their thinking about how the business model works.
I couldn't agree more. Lisa and Rich, maybe about a minute each. We're running a bit over, so Lisa, thoughts?
Sure. David used the example of 9/11. I think the other example is the 2008 financial crisis, where after that, the financial institutions, the large ones, were required to put resolution plans in place and not just think about deployment of assets, but kind of go soup to nuts in terms of looking at their operational situations, and have literally corporate handbooks, they call playbooks, that you can pull off the shelf in the situation of crisis, and think for everything from corporate governance to information gathering to how to execute a plan forward to navigate through. And I think that one of the takeaways from here will be for every company to look at the strengths in this situation, what information they have access to, what were the specific issues they had to overcome, and it would be a great benefit. It's a horrible thing for all of us have to go through, but to think about what type of playbook we would have in place for the next situation, because it could be cyber, it could be worldwide, it could be a division, it could be local, it could be almost anything, and you're not going to be able to foresee the specific events, but what are the learning lessons you took from this in terms of governance, information flow, managing relationships, cash flow, all the things that we've been talking about, and how to create those guidelines and update them regularly so that you're ready for the next situation.
Great, thanks. Rich, final word with you before we close. Major impact on the boards coming
The one thing I want to add here is I mentioned earlier about trust with the board, and I mentioned at Broadridge we had that long succession process. We got very, very high marks from the street and a number of organizations for the succession we ran. And yet, because we had a fairly new CEO and we clearly have identified strong people in the organization, and you always talk about the proverbial bus, but now we're looking at a world where we had to expand our succession thinking, and on our last board call, we went into, okay, what if our CEO now gets sick? And it's something that's always out there, but this has brought it to a new level of intensity in terms of, not only for the CEO, but for every leader in the organization, where you've got a 1% chance for all practical purposes that you're going to lose that talent in the organization. So we've gone through with management, and they've shared with the board their plan, because again, I didn't think succession could be any more intense than it is, but this is pointed out that there are, at every level of the organization, it needs to be truly understood, particularly when you're working from an at-home environment.
Great. So, yeah, some big takeaways. A premium placed on this epidemic places on trust, on transparency, and on resilience as we come out of this. And we'll have further discussions, because companies are soon going to start to plan how they're going to come out of this, and that's going to be a big challenge for boards and for management in the weeks and months to come. So I just want to thank Sarah, Rich, David, and Lisa for joining us today. I want to thank all of you for watching. As I mentioned at the outset, the Conference Board has a wealth of resources to help the private and public sectors address the COVID-19 pandemic. There's a slide deck that's posted in the download section at the bottom of your screen. It has links to a number of recent and upcoming reports and webcasts. And so I just want to say thank you to you all. Stay safe and stay well. Thank you.
Thank you.